really quickly open the notes here. It's an FYI. The learning outcomes that we specifically want to cover are kind of designing our API routes. So we're just going to define them and better manage them in this module. And how can we implement HTTP requests and responses a little bit more cleanly in our code? And so this one, we'll see how it goes. I hope it's not too bad. Now that we have all the setup done from the first module, I think the transition into this second module will be a little smoother. I think always when you first are starting a new topic, and this isn't like me being like, this is not a smart thing, this is just like, I think common sense, right? Like when we first get introduced to a new topic and content, it can be a little intimidating and difficult at first. And I hope that this second module will be a little more approachable because we've hit that one initial wall and this next step isn't so hard. I hope that that's the case. Now, what we want to do is GitHub here. Thank you very much. It's under and demos. What we're going to do for this demo is I'm going to use the previous module's demo as my starting point, right? So I had sent out that form a couple of weeks ago or a week ago that was had you just enter in your GitHub username for me so I could add you to this team or a team, which gives you access to this repository here. This is the repository I'm just going to use. If you have not put in the request for access here, give me a moment and I will be able to add you to it. But as it stands, what I'm going to do, I just have a directory here. Let's do Turbo here. Just going to quickly clone this. And I'm going to just make a copy of this. And instead of it being that one, I'm just going to rename it. This is probably really small right now. But all I did was clone that repository and made a copy of it. And I'm just going to quickly delete the Git history. So this is now essentially a direct copy of the previous demo's finished point, removing the Git history from it. And that opened up. Let me just double check that I have my settings correct here. 22. Okay, so we do have a good font size in here. And give me one sec. I just want to open my notes. I most definitely don't have everything memorized. It was in my backpack. It is super cold being outside. Yeah, that's what I want. So focused on having that feedback thing set up that I didn't even bother to have my notes open. So, what we're going to focus on today is we're going to install one package just for some very, very basic logging in our application. So we'll be able to log all of our calls that we're making to our routes. And then we're just going to essentially set up the routing structure in our application. And as we hit each point, I'll kind of describe it a little bit. So right now, I just have a copy. I'm going to have to do a quick install. And has anybody in here still not have access to the demos? Muse. Okay. Muse, if you want to send me, if you do not have access, do you want to just quickly send me your GitHub usernames and I can add you? Let's say we have a model or a type that's just called an item. It's very generic. Well, items have routes. And I know I'm going to be placing these routes in a very particular location in my file structure. It's going to be relative to the source directory, because that's where my code is going to be. But I'm going to follow an API practice here. And I'm going to define a very particular file structure. Let's call it item routes. So this endpoint, this directory of API v1 routes, and then this file item routes does not exist. So it gives me a red squid. It's okay. I'm fine with that. I don't need it to be available at this moment. I will code it shortly. But I don't know if I've mentioned this before. This is like I don't know if we call it a standard, but it is a common practice for defining our API structure and our route structure. So I'm saying, hey, this is just an API, putting that in my path. This is the first version of it. This is where I'm going to store all my routes. And this is where I'm going to store all my routes specifically about items. The reason why I apply a versioning to start is, let's say I do have an API, I've developed it, and now we want to make some changes, maybe some large-scale changes. I don't want to disrupt all the users that are currently using my API by making major changes to it and disrupt what they're doing, because I could potentially cause some issues for them, and that would not be a very wise decision. What I'd rather do is introduce a second version of that API. So I would have another directory where I'd say, this is where all the V2 code is going to live, and it's going to have its own routes and whatnot. And then as my users at their own time and pace, they can then upgrade to my V2 version. I'll probably provide like, okay, this is an end of life for my V1. Before this time, you should be switching over to V2 to make sure that we can properly support you. So we've imported an empty file that doesn't exist. There are no item routes at this time. And I'm just going to scroll down here to, so scrolling down to below these endpoints I've defined, and I'm going to say app.use. Well, actually, I want to do this up further. No, I didn't. I'm going to go below. I'm going to do app.use express.json. Yeah. So before I even bring in these routes, what I'm saying is basically saying to Express, hey, you can start expecting some JSON payloads in our HTTP requests, and I want you to be able to handle JSON. So I'm just letting Express know, get ready for JSON. Then I'm going to go down here below these routes, and I'm going to say app use, and then I'm going to define a path slash API slash v1 slash items. Then I'm going to say, as a second argument here, item routes. So basically what I'm defining here is similar to what's going on above, for example, for this health check, where in the health check I define a path, and then there's a function that fires when that path is requested. But instead of passing a singular function, I'm actually passing a collection of different endpoints that will exist appended to this route. And we'll see how this works in a little bit. I'll clarify shortly about that. But right now, we just need to make sure we include this line here. It's not imperative that it is below these app.gets. It's just what I'm doing for our demonstration purposes. But basically now, anytime I make a request in the URL to this API v1 items, I could just append something to the end. And as long as I'm handling that within this file, we'll be able to manage it. You'll see shortly. So we've added these. Why do we want to start organizing our routes into a new directory? Which let's start creating that directory here. I'm going to say in source, we have API. In API, we have v1. And then in v1, you don't necessarily have to create each directory one by one like that. You could write in just API/v1/routes, and that would create all three all at once for you. But I was being very deliberate for creating all three individually. Why do we put these in here? Basically, separation of concerns, right? We want to make sure that we are organizing our code in a way that anything that is in related concerns is within the same organization. It makes it much easier to update and manage later on, and easier to read once you're used to reading it in that format. So I've created that directory, and then within that directory, I'm just going to create a new file called item. I totally screwed that up. I'll rename this bad boy. Typo in there. Okay, sorry. So here we have API v1 routes, and I'll just throw that in the chat too, just so it's super clear. So just because it's difficult to see this as it's kind of small. And what are we going to do in here? Well, I'm going to firstly import Express. I know I'm going to need Express to define these routes. Next, I need to. I'm going to be using router in here. I know this as a class type, and I'm going to be using it to define my routes. And we'll show you momentarily why. And we're just importing from Express. Another thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to create another squiggly. I'm going to say import star as item controller. I'm going to explain what a controller is shortly. From, and I'm going to put in another path that doesn't exist yet. Or it's I know I'm going to need this. Basically, well, when we get into the controller, I'll explain it. But that's where we're going to be managing things like our responses and requests. The routes map them, and then how we manage the responses managed in our controller. And in my route, I need to define a router. You'll notice in tech we reuse a lot of words from, like, say, networking, but then we reuse them for our software as well. The router you can kind of think about here as it kind of acts like, maybe you could define it as like a mini express application to define the routes for a specific resource. In our case, our specific resource is items. Right? And so I want to define some routes on this. So I can do just like we did in .ts and say router get. And in that get, I can just do my slash. And then there would be some action, some function that's called when that endpoint is hit. And I want to manage that with my item controller. And I'm just going to call something that doesn't even exist yet. But I know I'm going to want to do something called like get all items. That's one thing I'm going to do. So the default, when somebody goes to the endpoint, and keep in mind, say this real quick. Keep in mind, this is the entire route. Let me just quickly bring this over so it's clear. I'm just going to throw this in as a comment. They're not going to go to localhost 3000 slash to get to this endpoint. In fact, this endpoint is going to be 3000 slash API slash v1 slash items. Then the default of that is going to be just get all the items. I'm just appending anything I say router dot method to this pre-existing one that I define in the actual app.ts. So here I'm going to do another one. Let's do router. Let's do that. Good mistake. Let's do a router post. All over the place. Hands are cold. And believe it or not, I'm going to do the exact same path. I'm just going to leave it as root path as well. And we're going to do item controller dot let's say create item. I can do this because we're doing two different types of HTTP requests. One is a get and one is a post. Because they're a different type of HTTP methods, I can use the same path. It's just how I call that path that matters. Just like in Postman, how we can choose between a get, a post, a put, or whatever. Depending on the type of request I make, HTTP method request, I can reuse my routing. Let's do this. Router put. And in here, I'm going to do a slash :ID. Just like we saw when we were doing the coding challenge. In Postman, how I had those :IDs to manage what the ID was going to be in the URL. Here I can also define, I expect a path variable or parameter with the name ID. And we're going to say item controller. And we'll call this update item. And then finally, we'll do one more real quick. And then we'll do a delete. And in here, I'm going to do the exact same thing as above, ID. And we're going to reference another non-existent and finally, we're going to export. Notice on mine, my app.ts all of a sudden no longer read. That's because it was waiting for me to export something to assign to the item routes in. But yes. So I've defined a route to manage my GET requests. This is eventually going to be managed by a controller that's called getAllItems. I've defined an endpoint to do my posts, where it's going to create an item. The post where we're managing to create, put, endpoint to update an item, and put accepts a parameter in the URL. And then a delete, which deletes an item. This one also accepts a parameter in the URL of IC. So just to reiterate here, and I'll put this in as like a buff here. The own ID syntax here. This basically defines a dynamic path parameter. Is how you call it, path or route parameter. And so the controller will then receive whatever that value is there and use it for its purpose. What that purpose is, we haven't defined that yet. We just know I want to receive them. And obviously, we're not following a very natural development process here because I already know what I want to code here. So it's a little bit easier. So right now, I've defined this item routes. It's going to give me a red file name here just because I have not actually created this directory and item controller yet. So these are not going to work and they would throw us a bunch of errors. So we'll have to define that next. But before we do that, we should take a breather here. And let's take 10 minutes. So let's continue at 1:08. It can be, it doesn't need to be, it can go however you want to work it out. Arguably, everything that we're passing within here would be if we have a database largely associated to it as well. A database, so some sort of parameter within it. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here because we'll talk about databases and connecting to them with our APIs and wiring up all the data in the next module. For now, we have these endpoints. These endpoints, we want to do something. They don't do anything at this state. All they are some filler functions here that I've defined some names of, but they don't actually do anything right now. These would just throw some errors if I tried to run this application. What I need to do is in that v1 directory, I'm actually going to create another directory called controllers. So the controllers is going to be at the same level as routes in the v1 directory. So they are at the same level in the directory structure. And here's where I'm really going to be managing what I want to do when somebody calls one of these routes. And I'm going to create a file called item controller. Yes. This into chat there if you want to see the full path that I have there, just to make it a little larger in the chat. And so this is going to manage the requests and the responses for our routes. And in order to manage those requests and responses, I need to import those from Express. Or at least import the types from Express, I should say. So, because I know I'm going to be using a request, I'm going to be using a response, and there's another thing I'm going to do, and it's going to be called next function. From Express. I'll show you next function momentarily. I am going to, for the last time now, import one file that doesn't exist yet. So we're going to do import, and we're going to do star as item service, maybe from our relative location. Or sorry, one location back, I should say, not relative. Services, we'll have to create that directory, and lo and behold, item service. Heck, even VS Code's like, yeah, I know what you're going to do now, Dave. You're just going to name it that. So these are going to be the types that I'll be using here, and then shortly we'll be defining a service layer. But right now, we're defining our controller level. So what did we define in our routes? So we have some functions that I said existed. Well, they didn't exist, but I want them to exist. One of those, top down really, is get all items. So when somebody calls /API/v1/items with a get request, I want it to get all items. So I'm going to define a function that meets those parameters. And I'll just start off by exporting. So export constant. I'm going to name this as a function variable. Well, not function variable. Yeah, function variable. And this function is going to happen asynchronously. And it will have something that we're waiting for inside of it. It's going to receive a REQ. And that's our request, a response, and finally, something called next function. Next function is how I can manage middleware within my application. So after I do something in my controller, there might be some sort of action that needs to occur, and we're going to show you that shortly, what's going to happen as we build this out. So we have a function that we're defining here that's get all items. It's asynchronous. It takes three parameters: a request, response, and a next function. What does it return? Promise with nothing. So a promise is me basically saying something is going to happen. Something is going to be returned. Or not returned. Something is going to, there will be something that's going to happen. Expect to wait for it, essentially is what we're saying in very simple terms. So this is the entire signature of this function here. Let me just in case. And what are we going to try and do here? So what are we trying to manage? Well, essentially, what this wants to manage is, how do we handle the request? How do we handle the response? And do we need to do anything after something's happened? I'm going to try in here. And we're going to catch something eventually. And now this is just empty. Fix that momentarily. We're going to try something here. And what I'm going to try is I'm going to try and get the items. I need to await for those items. And the thing that's going to provide me those items will be my service. Well, all items. Eventually, my service is going to be managing getting my items for me. Sort of. If the controller level is where I manage my requests and responses, so it's just controlling actions here, like where things need to be going, where do I need to look for this, and how do I want to respond for this, right? Kind of think about it like as an operator in terms of like ancient phone times, where if you didn't necessarily call a number, you picked up the line and said, operator, can you get me this person or whatever. The controller's kind of doing that. The controller doesn't know who that person is. They don't know any details about them, and they don't know what they're going to say to you. All it knows, essentially, right now, is that it needs to get these items for you. That's all it knows. It doesn't know necessarily what's going on with those items and whatnot. So it just knows it needs to get the items. Then, if it does successfully get the items, it's going to say, yeah, 200, we're good. And it's going to return some JSON. That JSON's going to have like a message maybe where we say like something like items. No. Retrieved. Let's do that. And then there'll maybe be some data, right? Those items themselves. But that's how the response is going to be provided using Express. So I'm using specifically a response, a request, or an Express response to provide that payload back. The thing is things can go wrong. What if something broke here? Right? Some error occurred. I need to properly manage that. Right now, I don't really know what that error could be because it doesn't exist. So it's kind of a mystery. I'm going to leave it just as that. A very bad error handling at the moment. I'm going to call that next. And I said was another parameter here. I'm going to save it and just format it for me. But next is that next function from Express. And essentially is going to, if I had an error, I'm passing that error to it and saying, there should be some error handling in there down the line. Here you go. Here's my error. And we'll get into later on how we can better manage those errors. Because right now they're super vague. And you've probably heard at one point, hey, like we probably shouldn't just catch generic errors. And that is true and not true all at the same time. We want to catch and manage specific errors that we know of at the very least. So let's say at some point in this chain of events, I'm connecting to a database and I attempt to make a request for the database, and that request fails for some sort of reason, network reason, or database authentication reason, or something along those lines. I should catch that very specific type of error that is in regards to dealing with it, like whatever that happened to be with the database connection. And then that's the type of error to catch and manage. But that said, to suggest that we never ever catch like a generic error or something like that would be dangerous, because there will be instances where, just like in software security, there's instances where we don't know that we have made some sort of mistake in security, right? We don't know necessarily that we have a vulnerability. We would want to know, and we want to try and prevent those sort of things from happening, but we don't always know. And so it's also not necessarily a bad idea at times, and this isn't necessarily the best use case. It's not a bad idea at times. I just realized my indentation in this is double space. Oh. To catch a generic, because we just don't know if something else is going on, just as like a last fail-safe. Because then at least we can manage that. We can then say, okay, something happened that we didn't expect to happen, but let's manage that. And what we do, we need some sort of procedure to manage those. We're not doing that today. We will do this later, though. So for now, I'm just going to leave this very generic. So let's do this. In order to just get this all going in one demonstration. No, let's do them all real quick. So going to be just some copy paste, and then I'll make some updates to them, because all of our functions are going to look fairly similar right now, just with some minor differences. So I'm going to take this, paste it, and really quick, I'm going to go. The next one was this create item. Well, let's work on create items. So create item is also going to take a request. It's going to take a response, call next. It's going to return this promise, an empty promise. But instead of getting all items, I'm going to have a new item. And it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be create. And I'm going to be a little bad here. I'm just going to say RQ body. So previously, when we were talking about posts and patches and puts, Ian was wondering, so how would that look on top of the request? Things in the body are literally passed through the request body, and then I can access that body. Right now, I'm just throwing the whole body at my service that I'll create later. But I can reference it by just saying, accessing that request object, and then the body parameter off of that. And instead of this response here, I just want to change this to 201. Instead of saying items retrieved, I'm going to say item created. And instead of data items, I'll just say new item. Oops. There we go. So very similar, just renamed it to the create item, call the different service level function that doesn't exist yet, and I'm going to be passing it the body. I changed the status code to a 201, as this is just the standard that I would follow for this. And I just changed my message and the payload that I would have here. You don't have to call this new item, it could just be called item or something like that. I'm going to do the same thing. I just copied this one again. Next function I want to do is update item. And I'm just reusing the same name here. They're directly tied to each other. And instead of new item, we're just going to say updated item. That would work there. And this time, because this has an ID in the parameter, or a parameter in the actual route or path of our URL, and I want to access that, I'm going to do something a little different. Instead of just passing the body, I'm going to pass in front of it here. I'm going to access the request. I can say params, because that's going to access any of the parameters that Express can identify in the URL. And then I'm just going to do it by name. I'm still going to pass the body. So this way I can access a parameter, the URL, and I can access the body itself. So I can do both. Item updated. I'm going to change this back to 200. And I'm going to do this one last time. I'm just going to copy the function, paste the last one, and I want to do the delete item. Just delete item, delete item. But I don't need a... I'm not going to use a response here right now. I'm just going to say item service, delete item, and then the only thing I'm going to pass is its ID to this. And I'm not going to give it a data payload here. I'm just going to say item. So we're just going to delete an item based off of the ID that's passed in the parameters of the path. For all three of these controllers, 90% of the code, 80% of the code was all identical. I just copy and pasted them, renamed them to what I defined in my routes, and then I updated how I interact with the service layer and how I would manage the response there. So could you explain the number 200? Yeah, let's do this. Let's go into, we have the requests. Do they have a good session that I can share with you on the response types? Right here. Request. Response status codes. There we go. So there are quite a few. Can I? No, it does not. Very neat. So let's say, well, there's a lot of different code types. The standard that you'll have as like a 200 status as a response. Well, these are the response codes. It's 200 okay. That means we had a successful response. 201, that's the one I had for create item, as it's saying item created. So we have our status of created. It was a successful response again. 200 level ones are always going to be a success level, right? So either okay, created, accepted. There's quite a few, so I recommend you kind of just peek through these. In fact, here, let me toss that link into the chat there, the statuses. So depending on the type of request made, I will update the type of success response I would give. If I had, for example, like, let's say I had an endpoint that existed at one point in time, and then I no longer needed it, but people still accessed it. So I don't know. I know. Let's say I have a website and I'm doing a travel website. And on this travel website, I have a promotion going on right now for like 1 week, or no, maybe like 1 month. We have a special landing page on our website. And the landing page is like the page where literally when a user enters your site, that's where they land on. It's not always your home page. And maybe I did have a particular event going on for travel that, I don't know, like we're doing some event on Caribbean destinations or something like that. And I'm sending people to this landing page. And that's from like January 1st to 31st. Once February comes along, that whole process is completed. And when people go to that landing page, that Caribbean trips one, well, that deal doesn't exist anymore. So I really don't want them to go there anymore. But it's very possible they might try to navigate to that web page themselves for whatever reason, right? I would redirect them if that were the case. And in which case, I might do something like a 301. Hey, this path you're trying to get to has been permanently moved. So I might have to do a redirection, and then I might redirect them somewhere else. So they might actually get more than one response code. I might give them first, letting the browser know, or the whatever's making the request know, this endpoint's been permanently removed, and then there might be some action that occurs that sends you to another endpoint, whether it's a web page or API endpoint. So if I am managing something like that, then I would give a 301. Let's say you did like a request to an endpoint where you did not have access to it. It required you to authenticate before. You would get a 401. You're unauthorized. You shouldn't be accessing this. Forbidden as well would be the same thing. So like this is basically saying, well, it specifically says here, the server understood the request but refused to process it. Again, saying like, it's similar to 401 it says there, but it's forbidden. Even if you authenticate or re-authenticate, it makes no difference. It states here. But there's slight differences between them. 404 not found, that's one that we probably are all familiar with or heard of at least. And that's just saying the server just can't process this because it says, I can't find whatever resource you're looking for. It doesn't exist. So if we went back and looked here, when I tried to navigate to like an unknown, it said, hey, I don't know what that is. So it says 404. Don't know what that was. And so on. There's quite a few that you can look through. And typically a 400 level one is saying to the client, to the user, whether that's like the person browsing on a website or the person that's trying to interact with an API. The 400 levels are usually saying you're doing something wrong, the user's doing something wrong to a degree. And then the 500 levels are saying, I'm doing something wrong. I, the API server or whatever, have made some sort of mistake here. So 500 you've probably seen before too, and that's literally internal server error that's saying something unexpected has occurred and I cannot fulfill your request with it. So in a case where maybe I'm dealing with an error in my code that I haven't defined and typed for, and I don't know how to manage it, that might be a generic error handling, and I might be returning like a 500 status saying, I'm not sure how to deal with this error. I'm giving you a 500. Something's wrong with me. And so on. So there could be, again, many other reasons for giving a 500 error. It really depends on what we're doing. Same concept with the 200s as well. We use less of the 100s. The most that we'll deal with in this class, or course, I should say, is going to be 2 and then the 4s. Is there a designated case for every 200 value, or can we define non-listed ones as we want? So you can define your own error levels with like a code. Just be aware that not everybody knows what that would be. So you better have good documentation for why you happen to be using a unique error or status code for a response is what I would say with that. So there needs to be a very good use case for managing it. But yes, it is possible. But good question. Hopefully that clarified. Oh yeah, I got you gotcha. Okay, cool. All right. So we have these basically our controllers, which is, like I was saying, like our operator service trying to manage this. So 200 for put, delete, patch, actually delete packages. Most likely, I would just stick for 200 for those. I would stick for the 201, specifically also for our purposes. Okay. What's Russ complaining about? It probably just wants me to update that. Yeah. So I had the same issue you had there earlier today, where originally my app.ts refresh cache, no issues in VS Code, but for some reason it didn't like the routes this time around. So I just went back into the route item routes file. I just deleted the character, add it back, just to remap it there. Okay. Let's add this service layer. So if you can kind of consider maybe like our routes almost like our phone book. I'm just kind of like off the cuff thinking about this. The routes are kind of like our phone book. So these are saying these are some predefined places you can call, these predefined endpoints you can make a request to. And the controller is kind of like how we're managing the requests and responses from that. Like, so we're saying either this was a successful request, this was not a successful request, kind of like the operator in that sense. Then the service layer is more like this is where the business logic would occur. So I'm going to create a new folder in here, services. And in services, typo in there. In services, I'm going to call or create an item service.ts. So this is where I manage business logic. So let's say I need to do some sort of massaging, some sort of updates to the data in the response. And so for a new item, maybe I want to structure it a certain way. Maybe I want to structure this data in some manner. This is where that will happen, is in my service level. This is where the business logic occurs. Things that are not necessarily code logic, but business logic. So first thing I want to do is, I've been showing you interfaces. I'm really going to just quickly show you a type as well. Type of item. And they'll have an ID, which has a string type. Which I want this to be. Oh, it has a name, string type as well, and it has a description. Lo and behold, it's a string as well. Probably could have been more original with this. And I'm actually going to export this as well. This isn't necessarily the best way of going about this, but for our demonstration, we'll export it out of here. So this is just going to be our unique identifier for our item. This will just be the name for our item, and this is just a description of that said item. And in here, I'm going to then start. We're not connected to a database yet, so I'm just going to maintain things in memory here. So this item service right now, we're being very generic. We're going to go in the next module and start filling this in with actual and important actions. But for now, we're just going to kind of use it as a way to statically manage items and the history of them. So instead of a database, I'm just literally going to define an array of items. So here's my variable name. The type is going to be a collection of items. And right now, just by default, I set it to an empty. In here, I need to start defining my services. So I had a fetch or a get all items, I should say, not fetch. And so I'll have same idea here. Const items. This will just be, it's async, but it doesn't really do anything right now. And it's going to return a promise. But this promise is going to contain, it's not going to be an empty promise. I'm going to actually hide something realistic here. And within it, return items. So this is kind of some messy stuff here. This, in the next module, we'll clean this up and do something a little more productive with it. Did we export? So in controller, each one I did something a little differently here. I exported each function as I defined it. You could alternatively, instead of each item, you could say like export and then blank, and then in some curly braces reference each of your items within here. For our purposes, I'm just doing each time I define something like a type or a function, I'm just going to export those directly. So the get all items, I'm just literally going to return whatever happens to be in this list at that time. The create item, do the same thing here. Items. This code really likes to add that semicolon there. And same idea. Going to be an asynchronous function. This one, you can see, takes a parameter. So this one is passing an argument here, so we got to manage that parameter. And that is going to be the item itself. This is kind of messy here. I'm not breaking them apart. So I'm just passing the whole body, which is maybe not the best practice. We'll fix that later on as well. Right now, though, we're just worried about following the process itself, so I'm not going to be too strict on this. And it's going to be an item, and I'm just going to do this. I'm going to say it has a name, screen, and oops, also and promise. I put that above there. I should know better. Good night. So, if every time this is highlighting with the underlined red, it's because it's just waiting for me to actually define the return in the function. So, right now, this does nothing. We want to create a new item. We'll just say new item, but type item. And that is equal to B, and I'm going to make a dummy ID here. Let's say it's just always going to be the date dot now. Matter as long as something uniquely generated to string, yeah. Go. And could do like item dot name item description or something like that, where I do forgot the description. So I could do this. I could reference is define a quick little object in here with a name and description, and I could reference it based off of that by saying name is equal to item.name, description is equal to item.description, because our item has a name and description attribute. But because I've already defined the ID here, and these actually are the same, name, description, description, I could just destructure this without having to write any of that. I could just say item. And that will do the same thing for me. It will reuse the name and description for the keys, mapping them one-to-one, and passing the correct values to them. So this here is the same as me writing these manually. You can just destructure it that way, much quicker. And then let's do this items dot push. I'm just gonna add a statically. It's cool. It is cool. It saves a lot of typing. And then we'll just return that new item. You know something very, very bad, and I'm not documenting these for all of these, only because that would take a significant amount of extra time to demonstrate these things for you. So what I will do is when I share the final demo at the end, I will fill those in with how I would document this code for you guys. But for the sake of time, so you're not just seeing me necessarily type this code and type all my documentation for you, my comments, I'll fill those in later on. That's not necessarily the best practice of how I would do it while I'm writing my code, but I'm just trying to focus on like the core bits here. So that was my create item. My other ones were my update item. And so let's do that. And this one is going to be a sync as well. And the arguments update takes are, this one's going to take an ID and body. Okay. So here we'll do ID. I want to say it's a string because that's just the in where this is not going to be the final IDs that we use once we set up a database. But right now we don't have a database. Everything's static, so I'm just using some filler. So I know it's a string, so I'll just do the ID string. And then I'm going to do similar to what I did in this one here. I'm going to identify an item. And that item is just going to be a generic object here. And it's going to be something description. And that is going to do the same where I need to define a promise. All of these are a promise because we're making these requests over a network call, and we don't know necessarily what the results are always going to be. We're saying we're going to get back to you with what, and what are we going to get back to you with? Either we're going to get back to you with a void, we're going to get back to you with a collection of items, we're going to get back to you with a singular item, and in the update, I'm going to respond with an item as well. Here we're going to do so, and this one is going to be fairly similar. All I need to do is quickly get the index of my item that would exist in this collection, and to do that, I'm going to do items dot find index, and we're going to do some funky code in here. We're going to do Within this find index, I'm going to define a anonymous function, has a parameter of I.id is equal to ID. So basically I'm saying, look into this list of items, find an index where the ID, give me the index of that item where the IDs match. Let's add a little error handling to this one. Why not? Let's do if the index is equal to -1, which means basically if it didn't find an index from a 0 up, it's going to say, well, then the value is -1. And let's throw a new, we're going to be bad here. We're just going to throw a generic error. Item with ID. We're going to do string interpolation here. ID not found. So if that item doesn't happen to exist, we're going to throw an error. Otherwise, we're going to get that item based off that index we just index that we found. And it's going to be reset. And actually, this is why I said it put. Yes, I'm fine here. This is fine. Sorry. I was doubting myself at the beginning, and then I was like, I swear I had a reason to do this before. And I did. So basically, put versus patch. Patch, I'm updating only partially the object. Put, I'm completely replacing it, and here we can see I am completely replacing this item here. What's going on is I have my collection of items based off of the index where the IDs match. I am defining a new object here, and this object is going to be the ID and the item. Don't judge me on necessarily the full quality of this demonstrations code. This is meant to be only for demonstration purposes only. So items. So what's happening here is I am now returning that specific item that we just put there, just updated / replaced really. Jimmy.
It's just, how did you just like format that so quick, where it like separates into different lines? Yeah, that's like a cool tip, I guess.
I see. Sorry. The things you don't think to mention. I use Prettier, and so I have Prettier installed as a formatter, and then I set in my preferences. Where I set it. On save. Format on save. And so I basically every time I save my file, it auto formats it for me using Prettier. I would recommend doing the same. It will make life a lot easier for you. In fact, I believe in the in here it'll tell you exactly how you can set it up as well. So Prettier code formatter is like definitely highly recommended. I see your hands up there, Dante. 1 sec. Yeah, Dante.
Oh, I was going to say, in regards to these demos, do you think maybe in the future you could leave like small inline comments when you're showing us this to like explain what's happening, so that if we come back to these in the future, we can kind of understand what was happening?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, maybe 10, 20 minutes ago, that I'm going to be doing that. So I'm going to add comments in explaining those bits for proper documentation. How that would work. But don't worry. That is going to happen. But just for time of doing it right now, it just saves me a little bit of time so I can actually get the code here, talk about it, and then the final version that I deliver to you guys will have all that included.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. That was the update item. Certain things that I am doing here, like you don't necessarily need to do this sort of stuff. In fact, when we get to the next module, we're going to delete all this code because it doesn't really, not pertinent to what we're learning, at least in terms of an API. It's just some way of writing some of this code as a temporary solution, because we don't really have a proper data storage point to communicate with. Normally, what would happen, we'll talk about this more next module, is I would then be communicating with one other level that would be getting data for me, and I wouldn't do basically any of this stuff. I would just get that data response from my database and then make any sort of changes I need to do in the service layer to return it. Okay, so let's see, it's 1:50. Let's take 10, and we will continue at 2 o'clock. We'll finish just this. That's what we're missing, right? Okay, 2 o'clock. So what we'll finish today is, let's get this part running, and then we'll go through some examples of using it as well. So we have the update item. Let's add a delete item. So that's what it is, right? Yeah, delete item. Okay. And we tested this is an asynchronous function as well. And this will receive only the ID, I believe. Yeah. It's just a string. And this, I don't think returned anything. No return. We just say prompt void. Basically saying it will return. It will respond. Promise it will respond, but it's just going to not have anything in its response from the function itself. It's going to do something, but it's not going to return anything. Basically, what we're saying here. And I'm going to. This would be a good use case for having a function here. But, I'm going to reuse this code here to get the index. And I'm going to use this exact same here, in fact, too, to check if it exists. And then items dot slice. I will get rid of it. Index. We're removing something from the array here. Basically, what the splice means is the start of that array. So that's the index where we're starting. And the delete counter number. So this is optional. It has a question mark with it. And the number of elements to remove. So I'm saying start at the index for this particular item, and just delete one item from this array. And like I said before, I'll be filling this all in with some documentation later on. But just to get the demos kind of working and running, to be able to finish them in a reasonable amount of time, just refraining from doing that right now. Okay, so quick recap here. The service layer is where we will do any business logic. Right now, it doesn't really do that because I'm just kind of piggybacking on it at the moment to just manage our collection of items and creating items, getting items, updating those, and deleting them. But In the future, it's where we will kind of manage the business logic related to, let's say I make a request to our database, get some content back from the database. Maybe I need to massage it into a particular format, format, like a model or something like that I've defined as part of my business logic. That's where I would do it, is within my item service. And then I would return that to my controller, essentially. It allows me to more easily kind of update my code by breaking these things down into the routes, the controllers, and the service. So now when I am in a route, I only will add a route here if it doesn't need to. Maybe it can reuse a controller in here. Maybe it doesn't. The service is the same idea. Maybe multiple services get called in one controller. So maybe, for example, I don't have an example of it in here, but we can show later on in another class. Let's say, again, if we're thinking, I don't know, the social media is on my mind. Let's say you have somebody you've created a post in social media. I don't know what it is, social media. It's the post of some sorts, and people can like that post. A like could be another entity or object that we have, and it might be saved somewhere else in our database than the post itself. Because maybe I don't want to update that post every time somebody likes it. I just reference it and have another entity in my database that I'm using for saving likes. But I delete a post. I also want to delete the likes for that as well. Well, maybe then in that controller for deleting it, I would call the service for likes to delete all the likes associated to this post, then delete the post. So I don't want to delete it all at once or delete it in reverse order. I don't want to have what we would call those orphan items, where if the post is kind of like the parent and then it has as a foreign key, that post ID is also in my likes. If I delete the post first, now I don't have a way to associate necessarily vice versa, back and forth. So I would reference both those services to delete the items that I need in my controller. And then each service would do its own independent thing that I would manage, but call from one location. Right? So we can kind of think about it if I'm saying like the controller is kind of like a phone operator back in the day. Maybe that phone operator is setting up a conference call. So now it needs to connect calls to two different endpoints to bring this all together. So let's just see. I do want to make one added update to these controllers, actually. So I want to import type of item from my services. So right now in the controller, I'm not defining a type for a couple things. So it's not very TypeScript heavy. I did define it in the service up here. Realistically, a better practice would be for me to move it out of the service, which again, something we'll look at later on. But for now, I'm just going to put it in here. So I'm kind of sometimes showing you a bit of a wrong way to do it, and then we'll correct that as we move forward in the course. So where do I want to use this type? Well, I have, for example, here in my get all items, it should be, array of items. The new item would be an item. Dated item should be an item. Well, as that is the actual return type from those services, right? If I go to my update item here, it has a promise of an item that it returns. So in my controller, I should also define that this variable should also be an item as well. But for now, I'm just going to keep these things in the service and then just import it from there. But let's see if this works. So I'm just going to quickly restart my server. Those changes in it. And let's go into, let's do this here first. It's going to go localhost 1000 API items. See what happens. Right there. So this is just a GET request. By default, what's going to happen is if I put a URL into the browser URL here and just hit enter, it by default does a GET. And it calls item retrieve. And we can see that's what we expected here. Message of item retrieved and a data of items. And it has no items because we haven't created any items yet. Right? So all that happened was it just returned this empty array of items. But if I want to do more than the GET, I need to be using Postman here. So there's a couple ways. I already have a predefined collection that I made, but all I would do is, let's say, just create a new workspace to demo. I'm going to date this. And I'm working on my own API, and I'm like, maybe I'm doing it in Cemetery. I just got some stuff up and running, and I want to test it. I created a new workspace, and I just named it this, but you can name it whatever you feel is appropriate for what you're doing. And I want to create some new endpoints to test in here. I can say new HTTP, and that will, by default, just open up untitled request. I haven't created a title for this or anything. And set my type of request I want to do, the get, post, put, patch, delete, add options, or more. And in here, for example, I can just take that URL that I had done in the browser and paste it right into here. And I can run this in Postman. And name this. I should have named it something better. But, let's say we need a new collection here. I'll just say but we can say create collection, and I can say maybe I want to call this collection items or something like that. Save this into items itself here. So now I have a collection of items, and so maybe in my back end I have like more than just items. Maybe I have items, maybe I have posts, maybe I have likes. I could create a collection of items and group them together in Postman. I could create a collection of posts, and then I could add those in here, and then specifically add my endpoints as such within there. I could name this to all items, something like that. That'll update the name in there. Say, I don't know, let's add a request here. Let's now do the post. I just copied the URL because the URL that we defined our routes here for the post and the get are exactly the same. I Don't change anything in the URL path here. All I change is the type of request that I'm doing. Right? It's the type of communication that I'm doing. Parameters will remain the default here. But I can add a body. So if I click on body, by default it's none. If I just click on, say, like raw, I can then choose a data type, so like JSON. And in here, well, what does my body take for post? Well, let's take a look. Post, just going to control click create item. And I'm going to take something there, a name and a description. FYI, what I was doing is confusing. I just hold on control and I click on the name of the function being called, and it'll just take me to the implementation of it. So it takes a name and a description. I know this. Name. I think that needs to be quotes. Am I crazy? Description. Some description. Let's name this. Go. So I've defined a body for this by clicking on body, raw. I just defined a JSON object here. And if I click send now, I got my status code of 201 created. A message, item created, the data, which this was just the time, converted to string and set to the ID, some name, and some description. The ID was generated for me, and I've passed these two, and we can verify that I passed these two, right? By the route. I'm not defining how the data structure looks. In my controller, how I know to just look in the service here is because all I did was bad, and I passed the request in the body. But we can see in here, it takes an item of name and description. So I could do something along those lines, but I've just allowed it to map out itself. Later on, we're going to show you how to properly manage these values so we don't just send this request.body to my create item. We'll actually structure it correctly so it's much more easy to navigate. But really the core focus of what we're trying to show here is just the different ways that we can create the routes, the controllers, and a service associated to it, and map these down along the path here. So now, let's say this. I want to create same idea. I could just within here, I could just say a new request. And I'll call this one update item, the URL, but I need to update that to a put. And I now need to add that parameter for the variable in terms of how a post is referring to it. That colon ID. So it's a little small that you can see here, but I have added this to my entire request here. So let me just put this in the chat so you can see the entire URL. And it's pre-populated the key for me ID. The value I'm going to have to set. And I still need to set the body for this too. The value, I'm going to set it to this ID. That was the response from here. Because I know that that's an ID that exists right now. And in the body, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to click on raw, make sure that I have the JSON data type. Curly braces, same idea. I'm just going to put the name. And we're just going to say updated name. And then description. collection. Cap. I'm taking the returned ID from the create item, passing that as the parameter, this variable here in the put, and I'm just putting in some new values for the name and description here. So let's say I call this one now. See what happens. It updated that, it says. And if I go back to get all items, this was originally empty. I send the request again. Now I do have data. I have my updated values. I create another one. Get all items. And there we go. Updated that collection for me. And if I wanted to say update this one, maybe just go back to the parameters. Set this. It says it's updated that. It returns the ID I changed there. Here, if I now rerun this, they both are updated. If I were to like put in a non-existent ID, we done broke. We threw a 500. Not properly handling errors right now. So that's something we'll have to manage later. And finally, I also wanted to add endpoint into Postman for the delete item. So let's go back in here. In items, I'm just going to create a new request here. Delete item. And I'm going to copy my URL from put. And we're going to choose the method of delete. And the ID, well, I need to get one of these IDs here. So let's go with that. This one doesn't need a body. Just needs the URL parameter or your path variable. And I know this again because if I take a look, okay, the route, you can tell from in the route, it accepts a path variable because I've defined one there. Let's look at the function it will call, delete item. Delete item has a request parameter, that ID that we knew about right here. It has it, and that passes it along to the surface. But at no point is it doing what the update item or the create item are doing with the request body. It doesn't use it. I can see it doesn't use it. We don't need to worry about it. Boy, this is a bad way to manage what your parameters will be. There's like no documentation around this. What we're going to do in the future is we're going to define what the models will be, the data structure will be for each one of these requests. And it's going to be an actual model and not just like code documentation, but it's going to be an actual model that's validated when we make those requests to make sure that we're passing what's expected. So right now we're not doing it, and it's very open-ended, and we can do a lot of bad things because of that. And I mean, things we shouldn't do because they don't work well. But let's do this. I'm going to delete one of those now. This message, I deleted it. All items, resend that request, and lo and behold, it's deleted that one there. Same thing, I can go and I can update the value in here. Item deleted, all items, they're all gone. So that's how I can create my own collection for a workspace in Postman. add my own requests for each of those, and then call each of those types of requests. Seeing things like path variables, passing things like bodies. What we'll do is, I won't do any more demo code today. What we'll do is next class, which is tomorrow morning, we'll look at writing some tests for these now, specifically for the routes and the controllers. And I'll write some tests for you guys that you can reference for when you have to write your own. But we won't do that today, as we'll limit how much we cover, because it's 3 hours, and that's a long time probably to just see Dave doing this. But I should reference also, real quick, you can see the different requests that I've done here from the login with Morgan. And look at that. We can even see, compared to up here where I knew I was using a browser, what it's doing here, it's just basically the user agent for a browser. As soon as I switched to Postman, it knew my user agent was no longer just making it through the address bar in the browser here. It knew I was making the request through Postman and logged it as such. So I can see what type of device was, or how the format at least was of the requests. The different endpoints, you can see it even log the ID there. You never want to include any sort of like secure information in your parameters, because those will just be open and available for anybody to see. That's what I said earlier, your IDs should never be anything that's important in terms of easily identifiable information. So like for sensitive information, so it shouldn't be actually like, you should never ever set an ID to like, let's say you're the government, and I had a database that had people's social insurance numbers in it or something like that. Their social insurance number should definitely not also be the primary key of the table that's associated to that person, because that would be a very, very silly thing to do. Because if you are passing an ID as a URL parameter, which 100% does happen, it really shouldn't identify anything special to somebody that happens to be sniffing around and seeing these things going around. But anyway, so that works the logged. We can see when I made a mistake and purposely had that 500 run. Yeah, so tomorrow we'll go into testing these, and we'll start looking at the next assignment. Wednesday morning, I'm going to have some time to start publishing your feedback for the coding challenges, and start doing I'll start grading the assignments as well. But like I said, Monday and Tuesdays, I don't have time during the day to do that. I'm back-to-back classes almost, so for the most part, I'm pretty busy during those times. Anywho, any questions, comments, or concerns? Anything you'd like me to kind of clarify? Probably put you all asleep. Here. Let's do my share there. Like,
You know what?
Do you have any good resources for like using the VS Code debugger? Any particular ideas?
Resources for using it. So hold on a sec. Let me